Hey there, how's it going today everyone? We have quite a bit to talk about with Resident Evil today. Capcom has announced Resident Evil Requiem, the 9th mainline entry in the series, which will be releasing on February 27th, 2026. They've also shared some additional gameplay and information from the developers, along with announcing that Resident Evils 2 and 3 will be available on the PlayStation Classics catalog later this summer. So, without any further delays, let's get right into today's video. So we open up with the trailer showing us an FBI office in an unknown location with a new character, Special Agent in Charge, Nathan Dempsey, walking within the offices looking for a new main protagonist, Grace Ashcroft. Grace is the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, one of the playable characters from the Outbreak series. I'll talk about Alyssa in a moment, but for now I wanted to take a moment to focus on the report that we see Grace typing up here. I like the little nod that Capcom threw in there that I don't think anybody else has noticed or brought up, in that it's a bit of a callback to the beginning of Resident Evil 1 when Chris talks about how there have been a series of bizarre murder cases where victims have apparently been eaten. Well, here in the report that Grace is typing up, the wording is very similar. It says, a deceased individual was discovered in an abandoned government office. Preliminary analysis suggests that the deceased may be linked to a series of blank. Unfortunately, the trailer cuts away before we can see Grace finish the sentence, and even though in my mind I want to read it as a series of bizarre murders where victims have apparently been eaten, what she's likely trying to say is that the victim may be linked to a series of pathogen-based outbreaks, considering the fact that the report itself is an incident report involving a fourth victim in an unidentified disease. That's actually something I wanted to take a moment to focus on as well, because throughout the series we've had enemies infected with viruses, parasites, and recently mold, so this game could be the first in the series that has enemies infected with a disease instead. I think it would be really interesting to see what Capcom could do with that, since we've never seen enemies based on diseases in Resident Evil before, although something to keep in mind as well is that sometimes viruses and diseases can be misidentified, so it's possible that we could be looking at a new virus or variation of a virus we've seen in previous entries just being misidentified. But I'm kind of hoping that they are going to lean into the disease-based outbreak thing, because I think it would be great for something different and some variety in this franchise, at least in comparison to past entries. But on the possibility that we might be dealing with a new virus, or at least a new variation of a virus we've seen before, there's a possibility of seeing either or. If we're seeing a new virus, it's unknown at this time what it'll be called, but judging on what we've seen so far between the trailer, Capcom showcase, and first creator message, is that the general enemies we may encounter in this game may be zombies of some kind based on the images that we've seen so far in the reports, as well as the few brief glimpses of characters who've been infected in some way, with one in particular sporting a bite on his neck that looks very similar to the bite marks we've seen in the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. And while it's easy to assume that just because we have zombies potentially returning again that it must mean that we're seeing a new variation of the T-virus, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is, because in both games and CG movies there have been two instances of different viruses creating zombies, those being the C-virus or chrysalid virus from Resident Evil 6 and the A-virus or animality virus from Resident Evil Vendetta, not to be confused by the other A-virus also known as the Abyss virus from Resident Evil Revelations, which was the basis for the T-Abyss virus in that game. Yes, I am aware of the fact that these two viruses use the T-virus to some extent, but my point still stands that this could be a brand new virus even if it does base itself on the T-virus or any variation of it. Now there is also the possibility that it may be a variation or hybrid of a virus we've seen before, and any one of these could be returning at that point. I won't lie, I kind of want to see either the C-virus return in some way or even the A-virus from Vendetta, even if they are just new variations of those viruses that haven't been seen before, but a part of me feels like we're likely going to see a new strain or hybrid of the T-virus again, if that's what the biohazard of this game will be, no pun intended. I don't want to focus too much on this report, so let's move on to our next scene. Nathan speaks with Grace privately about another body being found that is exhibiting the same pathology as the others that they've been investigating. He tells her that he needs a good technical analyst and he needs her eyes on the crime scene. It's here that we first hear about the Renwood Hotel, which seems to trigger some sort of PTSD with Grace, because that's the same place where her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, was apparently murdered. This goes by really fast, but you can see what looks like a rundown bar or restaurant and some things that indicate that it was a crime scene, such as the warning tape tape, and markers indicating some kind of evidence like bullet casings, for example. The thing about this shot is that we don't see a body, we just see evidence of a crime scene that was being investigated, so it kind of leads me to believe that even though Alyssa was declared as murdered, she might still be alive, although it's also possible that it's not incorrect either, but her body was never recovered from the hotel. What I do think will happen in the game is that there will be flashback segments to go through similar to Resident Evil 7, where you'll play as Alyssa when she was investigating the hotel 8 years ago. The reason I believe that is because as soon as Nathan says he knows that's where Grace's mother was murdered, the trailer quickly flashes to some scenes of Alyssa investigating something at the hotel. Also, before he continues to say that it was 8 years ago, you can see this glimpse of a mysterious hooded man. We can't see his face completely, but you can see that his skin is extremely pale and it looks as if it were rotting. You can also see that underneath his hood he's wearing some kind of collared shirt. It's difficult to see with all these effects going on, but his clothes seem to be covered in some kind of filth. I don't think this mysterious figure is a returning character, but rather a new antagonist, or at the very least a look at our first zombie, or whatever potential new enemy type this could be for the game. Anyway, after Nathan mentions that it's been 8 years, we get a few more glimpses of Alyssa walking through parts of the hotel, and specifically with an over-the-shoulder camera perspective. Capcom has confirmed that this game will be playable in both first and third person at launch, but they do strongly recommend playing the game initially in first person. With that in mind, I do have a small theory regarding why we're seeing this small portion of what looks like potential gameplay with Alyssa and why it's specifically in third person. I think the reason why they're making that recommendation to play the game in first person is not simply because they think that's the best way to experience the game or to see all the small little details. No, I think the main reason why is going to be around how they want to tell the story for this game. Capcom also confirmed that the cutscenes will play in the perspective you decide to play in, and my assumption is that the developers want us to play in first person whenever we play as Grace, but whenever we switch to Alyssa or any other potential characters that might be playable in this game, we'll be forced into third person regardless of the camera perspective that we choose. And I feel like it'd be an interesting way to tell the story in a symbolic way, essentially saying that we're literally experiencing it through Grace's eyes, but through other characters we're experiencing it as an outsider looking in. I think that would be an interesting way to tell the story, and I know this is coming from me, someone who really wasn't a big fan of the series shifting from over the shoulder to first person gameplay with Resident Evil 7, but honestly, and I know this might come as a shock to some of you, I feel a little more inclined to try out Requiem in first person just because the option is available. I don't want to get too carried away talking about this specifically, but the last thing I will say regarding this is that I do get the feeling that despite Capcom clarifying that they were taking heavy inspiration from RE7 in particular, it does seem like we're getting sort of a middle ground here where it's a blend of what worked in the recent remakes on top of the Ethan Winter saga to give us the best of both, which I'm all for. Getting back on track here, Nathan says to Grace that perhaps it's time to face the past, and that's where we get additional flashes of different areas, this time without Alyssa. The first area we see seems to be a shot of an alley or street corner where the hotel is located. It then cuts to a shot of one of the rooms within the hotel, and then after that, we see a shot of 3 silhouettes. Now, this shot in particular is very interesting because it gives me the impression that these are likely scientists because you can sort of make out what looks like a lab coat on the one on the very left. Something else I've noticed too is that you can hear a child screaming in the background, which implies that we're dealing more heavily into themes of child experimentation, which isn't necessarily new for the series, but it might have more involvement with this game's story. I have a theory around this though. We don't know who Grace's biological father is because Capcom never made mention of it, and I was originally thinking that there might be some connection with Leon possibly being her father if Capcom was retelling some old lore from the series by having Alyssa be the girlfriend that he broke up with prior to the events of the original Resident Evil 2. But now I'm starting to think that we're actually going more in a direction that mirrors Evelyn from RE7, where Grace could possibly be the byproduct of a new BOW, which would mean that Grace might not be Alyssa's biological daughter, but instead her adopted daughter through circumstances we'll find out within the game. Alyssa may have rescued Grace at a young age and adopted her from there, possibly investigating the hotel and the people that experimented on Grace on her own time. The people who conducted these experiments might have been associated with the Connections, an organization that's been vaguely mentioned in both Resident Evil 7 and Village, At least that's what I'm speculating to be the case, because there's not a lot of evidence, or at least concrete evidence, to support this theory just yet. There might also be some kind of link between what happened 8 years ago and the room 204, because we can also see a brief shot of the hallway leading up to the door to that room number in particular. From there, we see Grace wake up from being unconscious, being tied down to a gurney, and it seems as though she's hooked up to an IV, possibly getting a blood transfusion. What's a little unclear here is if Grace sustained a serious injury to her chest, or if she had some kind of haphazard surgery performed on her while she was unconscious. I don't know about anybody else, but I do get these Revelations 2 vibes from this scene alone, because there's a possibility that Grace is infected with whatever it is that's creating the BOWs for this game under the circumstances that we're seeing in the trailer here. Moving on from that point, we see a few additional shots with the voice saying "stay close, they're coming," although we don't see who the voice belongs to. My guess is that we're hearing Alyssa speaking to Grace 8 years ago when she was being rescued.
Stay close. They're coming.
Also, I want to take a moment to focus on some of these areas we're seeing as we're hearing this voice. The first area is very reminiscent to the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil 1 and the Spencer Estate from Resident Evil 5. And I have a theory as to why that might be, but I'll get a little more into that in just a moment. Next, we have a brick wall with various missing persons posters on it. These various posters may have a connection to what's happening at the Wrenwood Hotel, because we can see what looks like a silhouette, probably of the mysterious man we saw earlier in the trailer when the camera is zoomed in on some of these posters. If I overlay the frame where we see the side profile of the mysterious character, it seems like it lines up to some degree with that part of the trailer, so there's a high possibility it's him. Anyway, we also get a short look of a city sidewalk, although we don't exactly know where this is, but I do have a theory on that as well. Based on the concept art that Capcom has shared, it looks like Grace is walking through the same city sidewalk, but there is one key feature that most of you may have overlooked, and that's the elevated subway line. Now, I know it would be easy to assume that this could just be any city in America, but I do have a hunch that this might actually be Chicago, and more specifically under the L. The reason why I think this might be Chicago is because with Requiem, we'll be returning to Raccoon City to some capacity, and just a reminder that it is a small Midwestern town, which would make sense for it to be close enough to Chicago. Also, in the original Resident Evil 2, John Clemens, a character we've only ever heard about via a note in the original Resident Evil, along with Ada mentioning him in the original Resident Evil 2, did transfer from Umbrella's Chicago facility to the Arclay laboratory within the Spencer Mansion. So it seems to make the most sense to me if the Wrenwood Hotel is located somewhere in Chicago, since that would likely be the closest place to Raccoon City that we know of at least. Also, if we were to compare this concept art to the stock image of Chicago itself, you can see that it has a very similar look and feel, so I think it's safe to assume that this is in fact where this part of the trailer is taking place. I think it's going to be really cool to see Capcom make an interpretation of the city, since I'm originally from Illinois. Getting back on the topic at hand here, we do see in our next shot another mysterious figure who says, "I know that you're the one that I've been looking for, special one, chosen one, Miss Ashcroft."
I know now that you're the one that I've been searching for. The special one. The chosen one. Miss Ashcroft.
I've seen some wild speculation as to who this might be, but I do believe that it is a new character that we haven't seen before, or at the very least, if it is a returning character, it's not one we've seen much of in the games, instead a character we may have only really read about through notes throughout the series. However, before we get into speculating as to who the character might be, I want to take a moment to talk about what we can actually see of the character. So if we zoom right in, we can see that the character is wearing a black snakeskin jacket with a textured leather glove that looks like they're fingerless. Additionally, we can see the back of his head and part of his face. Something else to keep in mind here is that while we can see that the character seemingly has dark colored hair, we might not be able to accurately see the hair color due to the poor lighting within the room. We can also see that his skin seems to be rotting or degrading in some way, and unlike his hair, we can clearly see that his skin is rather pale, almost as if it were decaying. The only question is, who is this character? And while it's highly likely that this is a brand new character to the series, I have a theory that it could possibly be Oswell E. Spencer back from the grave. Now, I know that sounds crazy considering that in Resident Evil 5's Lost in Nightmares chapter, he was killed by Wesker, who ripped his heart from his chest. However, given that this series is no stranger to really crazy or outlandish twists and turns, I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibilities here. Part of the reason I believe this could be Spencer is because of the fact that there was a brand new render for the character for Resident Evil Resistance, and while that game isn't canon, it does beg the question as to why make a brand new character render for a character that hasn't been seen since the original Resident Evil 5. Granted, Alex Wesker also had a brand new render just for that game, but I strictly want to focus on Spencer here. Now, the one thing that both his Resident Evil 5 and Resistance counterpart have in common is the IV injection on the left side of his head. It's never really specified as to what kind of fluid Spencer is on, but we do know that at some point he asked Alex to work on a virus that would prolong his life and restore his youth, but she ultimately betrayed him, and while he did attempt to do this on his own later on, he never succeeded as far as we know. So what if he was injecting himself with a slow-acting virus, one that didn't show any signs of emerging symptoms, side effects, or promise prior to his death? I think that would explain the look of his flesh, which again does look like it is rotting to some degree, because it could be a situation of whatever he was injecting himself with actually did manage to revive him to some capacity, but at the cost of his flesh potentially staying in this degraded state. I don't think that's too far-fetched considering that Albert Wesker went through a very similar process of being killed by the Tyrant in Resident Evil 1, only to be revived and gain superhuman abilities because of the prototype virus that William Birkin injected him with prior. So it's entirely possible that Spencer took a precaution prior to being killed by Wesker, or at the very least during his time researching possible alternatives. Also, going back to what the character says in the trailer, I know that you're the one that I've been looking for, Special One, Chosen One, Miss Ashcroft. To me, that sounds like something Spencer would say, especially given the fact that he would probably still be looking for ways to regain his youth. I wonder what about Grace makes her the special and chosen one then? Maybe she's potentially immune to whatever the BOWs are infected with, possibly having some kind of special ability that no one else possesses. I'm really interested to know what the connection is between these two characters if this really is Spencer returning from the grave. One other thing that I want to bring up around this theory, which actually ties into the next portion of the trailer, is that we do see the remains of Raccoon City, and I do think that it's important to keep this in mind, that if this is Spencer coming back from the dead, I think it would make plenty of sense for him to go there because that's the place that no one would expect him to go to. I don't think anyone would just go there unless they knew something about Raccoon City or the surrounding Arklay Mountains that others wouldn't be aware of. Not to mention that if this is Spencer, then I think part of the reason why he would go there in particular is likely due to the fact that Umbrella, or at least Umbrella as he knew it, is no longer around. Something else to keep in mind here as well is that the game has a slogan for the subtitle: Requiem for the Dead, Nightmare for the Living. So what if it's not just about remembering the characters that died during the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3 specifically? Instead, what if it's also about remembering those responsible for the outbreak of Raccoon City? I think that someone like Spencer would technically fit the bill, considering that it was his company, goals, and ideas that were the catalyst for all these events that took place, whether they be directly or indirectly. Remembering the man responsible, who for all we know is dead, but is still a nightmare for the living. In other words, you can kill the man, but not the idea. Since we're on the subject, I also wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit more about the locations featured in this game. With Raccoon City being one of the locations we'll be revisiting for the game, some of you might be a little confused as to how the city is still even there. Well, firstly, on the official website it says, Raccoon City, a Midwestern city in the United States and the headquarters for the former pharmaceutical company Umbrella. In the face of the zombie outbreak in 1998, the government approved a sterilization operation, a missile strike on the city in an attempt to quickly bring the situation under control, but this was swiftly covered up. And secondly, because of the fact that Umbrella Corps is a partial canon game, we technically were already told by Capcom that Raccoon City, and more specifically the RPD, were still around, but in complete ruins. Believe me, it feels strange to have to bring up a game that nobody really wants to bring up or talk about, and really should have no place in the lore, but sadly there's really no way around that one little tidbit from that bad game. It is unfortunately canon. Maybe Capcom just really wants us to remember this dead game while we're at it. Jokes aside, this has me wondering as to how much of Raccoon City we'll be able to explore, and would we be able to explore the outskirts of the Arklay Mountains. I get this strange feeling that at bare minimum, we'll be revisiting the Spencer Mansion itself, going back to where it all started. Although I do think it'd be really cool if we got the chance to also revisit the training facility from RE0 and the abandoned hospital, or whatever really remains of it from Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. especially since it was a chapter centered around Alyssa Ashcroft. But going back to the Spencer Mansion, after seeing the Raccoon City ruins, it really reminded me of the cancelled Resident Evil game Biohazard Dash, the original sequel that was planned for the series prior to Resident Evil 2. Biohazard Dash was going to feature plant-like enemies and zombies covered in plants while revisiting the ruins of the Spencer Mansion, featuring new rooms and locations not seen in the original Resident Evil. So while Requiem isn't featuring any of the enemy types that Dash was going to have as far as we know, it is reviving an old concept of revisiting familiar places. Capcom does have a history of bringing back cut concepts into other Resident Evil titles, so it'd be rather surprising if they didn't do that with this game to some extent. But I think the potential of them reviving concepts from Dash is there, especially if Capcom intends on remaking Resident Evil 1 again, which I do believe Capcom has slowly been working on. The reason I believe that is because Capcom did at one point express interest in remaking Resident Evil 1 again in a similar style to Resident Evil 2. And it's not just that though, I think that there are a few portions in both Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake in particular that look fairly similar to what the Spencer Mansion would look like if it was created in RE Engine. I think it all lays out the groundwork for what a modern Resident Evil 1 remake could look like, and if we do end up going back to the Spencer Mansion in this game, it could be a neat way for Capcom to tease us with that potential, even if we're only limited to exploring certain parts and key areas of the mansion itself. And that's also why I think it'd be really cool if they could do the same thing with areas from Resident Evil 0 and Outbreak File 2, because arguably those games have potential of getting remakes in the future as well. Although I think it's more likely that Capcom will strictly focus on remaking mainline games, fans have been begging them for years to do an official HD collection of the Outbreak series, so maybe they're more open to the possibility of remaking them. In any case, I don't want to get too carried away here, but thinking about the possibility of us not just revisiting Raccoon City, but also the Spencer Mansion is really exciting for me, and I can't wait to see if any of my theories hold any weight here. Getting back to the trailer, we hear several characters speaking, and they say the following. Investigating these strange deaths, huh? We need to keep our voices down. Have you seen the same shit that I've seen? Please know that you are my hope, and everyone's gone.
Investigating all these strange deaths, huh?
We need to keep our voices down.
Have you seen the same shit I've seen?
Please know that you are my hope.
Everyone's gone.
All said by 5 different characters that we haven't seen yet. Some of these characters might be talking directly to Grace, but I think there's one in particular that isn't necessarily directed towards her. The voice that says, "Please know that you are my hope," sounds like someone is leaving a message to anyone who could help. And I've heard theories that this could potentially be Ada, but I don't personally think that's going to be the case since Capcom has confirmed that Leon won't be in the game, and those two are usually seen together. Although, Capcom could be misleading fans on purpose, which they have done in other games, even as recently with Onimusha Way of the Sword, where they claimed Musashi was a brand new character to that series before officially confirming that it was him, while still insisting that he was new to the series. My guess would be that if Leon and Ada are returning for this game, Leon might be to Grace what Chris was to Ethan, and we might even have segments of Leon being playable. Anyway, as we continue with the trailer, we see a cutscene of a character who seems to have been bitten by a zombie or BOW, and he yells to Grace to get away from him. Now, what I find really interesting here is that Capcom edited the trailer in a way where you can see a brief frame of the cutscene playing out in third person before it shifts into first person. It's really easy to miss because it goes by so fast. Also, I'm not sure who this character is. Maybe he's someone who works in the FBI with Grace. After that, we see a glimpse of the new Pursuer BOW that will be featured in the game, and I've seen speculation that this might be Lisa Trevor or possibly the Suspended, the pseudo-zombie turned Licker from Resident Evil Outbreak, but I don't think it's either one of those. This is probably just a new BOW that was specifically made for this game, although I will say that the similarities to Lisa are there, especially the visible chains that we can see on her arms. Next up, we also see the mysterious hooded figure choking out another character. It's still really difficult to see who this character is because their face is even more obscured here. After that, we see a police officer who's screaming in pain, likely turning into a zombie or whatever the BOWs of this game will be. Something else that's really easy to miss here is that it looks like he's holding onto a rifle or shotgun that you could just barely make out because of the stock that's partially blurred into the background. Maybe this is the scene where we'll get the weapon. It's also possible that this scene is related to a potential boss fight early on in the game. We then see a woman walking down one of the halls of what looks like the Renwood Hotel. This character might not be a new one though, because it could potentially be Natalia from Revelations 2, all grown up, fully under the influence of Alex Wesker's mind swapping. It's the hairstyle and the clothing that she's wearing that looks very similar to me. I think it would be really nice if Capcom were to finally follow up on the ending of Revelations 2 in some way, because it was left ambiguous. Also, I don't think just any character would be casually walking around like that unless if they knew exactly what was going on, because they were probably responsible for it. Also, the area they're walking through seems to be another part of the hotel that's seemingly been converted into a hospital or lab of some kind, which we can see a little better with one of the screenshots that Capcom has officially shared. I'll show the screenshots in just a moment, but in the meantime, I wanted to talk about the last bit of the trailer here. We see the face of either a zombie or that BOW from earlier in the trailer screaming before it shows the title of the game. I personally like how this is a bit of a callback to Resident Evil 2 Remake, so it seems like Capcom is probably going to have callbacks and references to anything related to Resident Evil 2 for this game, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Anyway, that's all we have for the trailer, although we still have more to talk about, but before we get into that, I wanted to show you all some of the screenshots that Capcom has shared for the game. I like this one of Grace simply standing in the hall with only a lighter. It really reminds me of the classic games, just simply based on the camera perspective. Maybe if we're lucky, Capcom would consider bringing back fixed camera angles in a patch or through DLC, since the game already features both first person and over the shoulder perspectives on day one. Moving on from the screenshots, we do have some additional information that was shared by the developers via the Capcom showcase. Director Koshi Nakanishi mentioned that the core concept of the game was focused around addictive fear, and the catharsis of overcoming fear itself can be addicting, which makes players want to keep playing. He continued on by saying that the intense focus, while scary, makes for a fun game, and that served as a launching point for Requiem's development. Now, before we continue on with the showcase video, I wanted to take a moment to focus on these short clips of the game that show off a little more of the Renwood Hotel. This first area we see looks like a potential lobby or reception area that's shrouded in darkness. This is probably just going to be one of the early areas we'll be traversing through early on in the game that might connect to some major key areas of the hotel. We also get a look of Grace running through the halls of the hotel, and we can see a couple of things. The first is some signs on the wall, with one in particular reading, "Sister can be located at." Unfortunately, it doesn't exactly say where, and I'm assuming that sister is likely referring to a statue, but there is an off chance that it might be referring to the BOW that's chasing Grace throughout the game. We can also see that Grace is running into room 203, and I don't think this is a save room because the door not only remains open, but the BOW approaches Grace just before the video continues, with producer Masachika Kawada going a little more in depth about the game itself. Speaking of which, Kawada states that Requiem is a single player offline game, which is something we'll talk a little more in depth about momentarily. Anyway, he goes on to say that horror is an important aspect of the Resident Evil series, so they wanted to make fear a key element of the gameplay. Personally, I don't really find the franchise scary, or rather, I don't think that fear was ever this major element within the games before. Really, I think ever since Resident Evil 7, they've been really trying to emphasize horror more than ever before, which, to be fair, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I've always found that horror in Resident Evil games took more of a backseat in favor of heavy emphasis of survival elements, at least in the games that were survival horror. In other words, the games were always survival games first and horror games second. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on this topic, so let's talk about the character segment of the video. Now, to be clear, I won't go over everything in this portion of the video because some of the information is a little redundant, especially since we've already known about it from the trailer itself. So instead, I'll only be talking about the relevant information from the video. With that in mind, director Nakanishi stated that Grace is an introverted character who easily gets scared, which is new for the series. He also said they wanted to make a character that would experience horror the same way that the player does, but she will apparently learn to overcome her fears throughout the story. Additionally, he mentions that as an analyst for the FBI, she's trained with guns and is able to act with calm deductive reasoning. I find it really interesting that they are using some really key words here here, like being scared easily, experiencing horror, and also that the character overcomes her fears throughout the story, it really is starting to sound a lot like Resident Evil Revelations 2, and it seems like maybe there is more connections to that game in particular if my theories hold any weight. So I'm really hoping that that seems to be the case, because just based off of the wording alone, it seems like that's the direction that we're going in. One of the things that I took notice of here is the scene of Grace inspecting an item showing her covered in blood, and I think it's likely that she took damage prior to this cutscene playing because part of it looks faded. The next scene is something very exciting for me because not only do we get to see a new area of the hotel, but we can also see Grace's handgun. So before I get into talking about the new location, I wanted to focus on the handgun first. Now, initially I thought this was going to be a Walter PPK, but after looking over this part of the footage several times and doing a little more digging, I think what we're actually looking at is the SIG P232, and what really gives it away is the design of the slide and the grip of the gun itself, even though they have clearly taken some liberties on the design here. Don't worry, this one isn't a safety hazard that'll unalive Grace, at least as far as I know.
Did you see that? Holy crap!
Now, what's going to be interesting for me at least is that this is going to be a low capacity handgun, at least in comparison to the handguns that have been featured throughout the series, by only having about 7 to 8 rounds in the magazine depending on the caliber of ammunition it's chambered for. However, given that the last 4 entries in the series have featured weapon parts and attachments, along with the RE4 style of upgrades in the last 2 entries, I think it'd be very likely to see some weapon parts and attachments be present for this game, because I doubt they'll be bringing in a merchant or even the upgrade system from the original RE4, because it does seem like they're leaning more into how things were being done in the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. As for what kinds of parts and attachments would be featured in the game, I think it's a little too early to tell since we haven't seen all the weapons for the game just yet, but I think it would be safe to assume that we might see an extended mag for more capacity, a trigger and hammer for increased fire rate, and maybe even a longer slide and barrel for increased accuracy and damage. Keep in mind too that none of the parts in particular have to be realistic per se, since Capcom has toyed around with making fictional parts and attachments along with full-on fictional firearms in the past, even going as far as collaborating with companies like Tokyo Marui, a famous Japanese airsoft company that has not only released and sold several variations of the Samurai Edge, but has also designed the Sentinel-9, Leon's custom handgun that was originally meant for Resident Evil 6, but wasn't seen until Resident Evil Vendetta and only became usable in Resident Evil 4 Remake as a DLC weapon. Actually, one of the other things that's got me curious about this game since we're on the topic is if there will be any pre-order bonus weapons or special weapons to unlock throughout the game. With the exceptions of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 3 Remake, most of the recent Resident Evil games have featured some kind of pre-order DLC weapon of some kind or early unlock. Considering the fact that Raccoon City's featured in the game, I think it would be really cool if we could see a pre-order bonus for Leon and Claire's handguns fully upgraded from Resident Evil 2, the VP70 and Browning High Power, unless if they want to go with Claire's revolver from the Resident Evil 2 Remake specifically. Or they could go with the handguns that have been featured in other games such as the 1911 variants, which were in games like Resident Evil Outbreak, 7, 2 Remake, and Village. Additionally, the Lemmy from Resident Evil Village, Glock 17 from Resident Evil 7, or even the Silver Ghost from Resident Evil 4 Remake could also make an appearance as a pre-order bonus weapon, if not all of them. Regardless of which it is, assuming that we do even get a pre-order bonus weapon, I am super excited to just think about the potential of what that pre-order bonus weapon would be if we are getting one. Now, to get back to the footage, however, I am really liking the aesthetic of the Renwood Hotel here. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but it gives off this very cold and sterile look based off of the color palette, which is a nice touch, and I think it also feels very grandiose in a way that feels very similar to the castles we've seen in past entries. Also, we get a look at a box being inspected here, and it has a single screwdriver inside. I'm not exactly sure why they felt the need to show us that specifically, but it is there. However, while that was being shown, director Nakanishi talked about why Grace was a better fit for the game as opposed to Leon. According to him, they've always thought about making Leon the protagonist, but making a horror game around him is difficult because he wouldn't scare so easily, and nobody wants to see Leon get scared because he's a bad match for horror. Now, I do want to address this comment because I think Nakanishi is right about what he's saying. However, I do have criticism regarding the statement. And just to be clear, even though I was heavily critical of him and Masachiko Kawada when it came to Resident Evil 7, I do believe that both developers are open to criticism, and in my opinion, it really showed with Resident Evil Village. The criticism that I have have currently isn't aimed at him directly in this case, but rather at the developers that have worked on the Resident Evil series over the years. Yes, Leon is a bad fit for horror, but he only became that way because of the developers and the writers for the game since the original Resident Evil 4 made him that way. The same thing could honestly be said about Chris as well, all things considered. So honestly, I think the only way they could have addressed this is if the remake for 4 deviated heavily from the action-heavy nature of the original game in favor of more survival horror gameplay, which it obviously didn't do, on top of retconning all of the CG movies, or at the very least considering them canon to the original games and not the remakes, or even addressing his age and make it so that he can't do all the bombastic things that he used to be able to do when he was younger. Although I don't think that excuse works so well because characters like Joe Baker exist. So with that in mind, I don't think this statement really comes as a surprise, especially because it's being said by somebody from Capcom. I figured I should let that be known before I continue talking about this statement because it does annoy me to some extent to hear that being said. That critique aside, it's interesting to hear that Leon specifically was being brought up, and it was also mentioned at Summer Games Fest that the game itself will feature action as well. Even though Capcom has stated that the game isn't going to see his return, I have my doubts, partly because they've taken a similar approach to the marketing of Onimusha Way of the Sword by stating that the main protagonist was new to the franchise, but as it turned out, it was actually Miyamoto Musashi, who's been in Onimusha Blade Warriors, the Onimusha anime adaptation, as well as the Onimusha Dawn of Dreams manga. So I think Capcom is intentionally misleading fans here to keep any potential surprises more fulfilling. Personally, while I am a little tired of seeing Leon and Chris, I am a little more open to Leon returning because if we want to be technical, he hasn't been in a mainline game since Resident Evil 6. Whereas Chris, on the other hand, he's been in several Resident Evil titles going as far back and consistently since Resident Evil 5. I'd actually be really disappointed if Chris came back again because he's been in 5 games back to back, so I think it'd be a nice change of pace to see Leon again. Of course, I'd prefer any other characters we haven't seen in a really long time, like Jill or really anyone else they've consistently ignored for years, but given that Capcom likes to play favorites with those two in particular, I think there's a high chance we'll see Leon. Keep in mind too that nothing's officially been confirmed, so maybe they're not intentionally misleading us at all, and it might just be a game that only features Grace with segments of Alyssa being playable like I speculated earlier. Moving on from that, the art director Tomonori Takano goes on to explain the emphasis on the visual details for this game, noting the redness in Grace's face. He also goes on to mention the realistic hair physics, which were pardoned thanks to having a professional created wig which was used as a model to create realistic effects. We also have producer Masato Kumazawa chime in as well, and he talks about being able to switch from first person to third person. There's not much to say about what he's talking about here since he's just going over the experience depending on how you play. There is, however, small portions of additional gameplay, both in first person and in third person, going through some of the early areas of the game. Here I've taken a side-by-side comparison of how the game looks in both perspectives for the areas they go through. They really nailed the lighting in this game in my opinion, especially in these early areas we get to see. Director Koshi Nakanishi also talks about how the game takes place 30 years after the Raccoon City incident, more specifically when the missile wiped out the city, and I think they've done that on purpose because of the fact that Requiem is releasing just before the 30th anniversary for the series. I'll talk more about the anniversary in just a moment, but to get back on topic, Director Takano also talks about how the series became really popular with the story set around the original zombie outbreak, and how we've seen various characters throughout the years who have faced hardships due to the incident, and those characters who have overcome and grown because of that incident. He goes on to talk about how figuring out how to tell a story that came off of all that came before was a daunting task for him. The wording here is really interesting because it's not directly pointing to anything concrete. What I think he's talking about is the difficulty of telling a story from the perspective of someone like Grace, who was likely born after the incident and wouldn't really know the horrors that occurred there. Then again, hypothetically speaking, if my theory about Alyssa holds any weight, that could also apply to her, since we've already seen characters like Chris, Jill, Barry, Claire, Leon, and Ada all changed over the years after the events of the first 3 games. Even Koshi Nakanishi mentions how there were a lot of characters specifically that were tied to the original outbreak who lost their lives, or that their lives were dramatically changed from it. Alyssa would really fit that bill, especially because we haven't seen her since Outbreak File 2, so I could imagine how difficult it might have been to come up with a story around a character we haven't seen in such a long time. Nakanishi also went on by saying that there have been many characters that have come out of Resident Evil, stating that the game is a requiem or eulogy to those that came before. He also stated stated that Resident Evil is a series born from Umbrella and the Raccoon City zombie outbreak, and because of that, the development team chose the subtitle Requiem as a way to mark a milestone for the series. Again, this is probably to go alongside with the 30th anniversary, which is in March of 2026, which producer Kumazawa makes mention of hoping that the game lives up to 30 years worth of games that have been released up to that point within the franchise. I'm also really hoping that this game will live up to expectations, because while I wasn't a fan of Resident Evil 7, I do think that all of the recent games that came out after that game have generally been really good, and I'm really expecting this one to be potentially the best one in the current trilogy of games. That concludes the Capcom Showcase Spotlight, but there's still the creator's message. Now, with the creator's message, I'm not going to go over the full video because it mostly goes over the same information, just with a little more depth. Instead, I want to focus on a few key points that make this video stand out. The first being the scrapped build of the game, which they did show small portions of gameplay for. Director Koshi Nakanishi talks about how many fans heard the rumors about the game, specifically citing rumors about it being open world or an online game. He confirmed that they were experimenting with these concepts at one point while footage of the prototype build was being shown. He also stated that the team had some interesting ideas, but in the end they were scrapped because they realized that fans wouldn't have liked the game, and that's ultimately what led them to develop Requiem as we know it now. Two things that I want to go over here, starting with what he said about fans not wanting online or open world games. With open world games, I can understand because generally speaking, I do think that genre has worn out its welcome. I did a video on this a few years ago talking about the subject, so feel free to check that one out if you haven't seen it before. But that said, I can maybe see that working out for a Resident Evil game, not necessarily an open world game, but definitely a linear game with open segments, or open linearity as I like to refer to it as. Again, something that I talked about in another video that you can check out if you haven't seen it before. That's beside the point though. I do see the potential in something like that, especially if there's heavy emphasis on backtracking and exploration like there was in past entries. And then there's this idea that fans wouldn't want an online Resident Evil either, which I don't fully agree with. The reason being is that I think this notion comes mostly from the lack of success seen in games like Umbrella Corps, Resident Evil Resistance, and Resident Evil Reverse, which were reviewed poorly. Even the Outbreak games, which fans have come to appreciate over the years, received mixed reception when they initially released. Personally, I think Capcom could do a brand new game that features co-op, and fans would probably have fun with it because in my opinion, whether it's a co-op mode like Mercenaries or Raid mode, full-on story modes like in Resident Evils 5 and 6, or even the Outbreak series, these experiences are fun, especially in the case of the Outbreak series, which feels much better to play with live players, which is the complete opposite of any experience that involves PvP. The reason I say that for anyone that is unaware is because typically Resident Evil PvP experiences are poorly balanced, where it's clear that either Capcom or the developers they've outsourced to work on these experiences clearly don't have any understanding of how to make a balanced and fun game, or they clearly have not been given enough dev time to properly balance those experiences. So I don't fully agree with what Nakanishi has to say here, but I do get where he's coming from, because with recent online experiences for this series, they haven't been great, and I don't think that Capcom should specifically be making them, but I do think Capcom should listen to the fans and bring back the Outbreak games with some quality of life, considering that the community has been asking for it for years. I don't want to dwell too much on this comment though, so let's talk about the second thing regarding this portion of the video, and that's the gameplay of the scrapped game itself. Some of the things that I've noticed with the footage is that in most of the clips they always show at least 2 players on screen. Also, something else to point out is that there's zombies. My guess is when they were originally making this game an open world online game, they were possibly setting up the groundwork for what a Resident Evil 5 and 6 remake could look like, since both of those games featured co-op. This wouldn't be so far-fetched since Capcom has done this with Resident Evil Village, for example, where they took the key elements like the merchant and inventory, which were essentially the blueprints for what we could expect with the remake of Resident Evil 4, and how they would implement these ideas and features to improve upon them or do something different with that remake. Also, the fact that they're zombies has me really curious if they plan to keep that for the final game or not. Even though it does seem like zombies are making a comeback for this game, until Capcom shows off more, we just won't know until then. Personally, I do hope that they make a comeback, not because I dislike the different types of enemies that we've seen throughout the series, but more so because every once in a while, I do think it would be nice to see them return, especially if they can do new things with them. Moving on from that, there's a portion of the creator's message where director Takano talks about the visual concept for the game being influenced by noir themes and metallic materials. While he's talking about that, we're shown a small portion of an early location in the game. It's just the outside of the Renwood Hotel, nothing special happens here, it's just mainly a showcase of how Capcom has implemented the lighting and reflections for this game, which look very impressive. There's 2 final things that I wanted to focus on regarding the creator's message. First off, we hear what sounds like a new rendition of the RPD main hall, which sounds more foreboding than ever before.
表 現できないかなというところで、ああいった髪型にしていますね。デザイン自体は簡単ではあるんですけれども、これを実際に 3D
Secondly, we get to see the concept art of Grace, and I'm really hoping that in future creator messages they'll show off more than just concept art of characters, but of enemies and locations as well, especially if they're going to showcase the earlier renditions of all those things. And that's all there pretty much is to talk about with Resident Evil Requiem, but there's still one more thing that we have to talk about, and that's the upcoming PS Classics releases of the original Resident Evils 2 and 3. The games will be released on August 19th for the PlayStation Classics catalog, literally on the day of Gamescom opening night live. However, depending on when this video is uploaded, they might already be available. They're likely going to do the same thing they did with Resident Evil Director's Cut and Dino Crisis by making them initially only available to PlayStation Plus Premium members before allowing the general purchase of these games for Standard Plus members and non-members, or for free for anyone that's purchased them back on the PS3, PSP, or PS Vita. But that's not the main reason I wanted to talk about these two games. Instead, I actually wanted to talk about what Capcom might be planning for the series since the 30th anniversary is coming up in March of 2026. I think Capcom is planning to make special editions of Resident Evil Requiem that are similar to the Resident Evil 6 Anthology and Archives editions for fans and potentially newcomers to buy on a much bigger scale. So I'm expecting that in the coming months we'll see that the PS2 to PS4 port of Code Veronica will be partially delisted and replaced with a PS4 and PS5 port similar to what happened to Siren, for example. More so than anything, I'm expecting a large-scale bundle for Requiem that includes all of the mainline games, both originals and remakes on PlayStation, and likewise something fairly similar for Xbox and PC with what's available on those respective platforms. Which is pretty exciting to think about. I'm really looking forward to seeing what kinds of collector's editions they'll be releasing for the 30th anniversary in Japan, since they tend to come out with really cool bundles over there. I personally purchased the Biohazard 15th anniversary package a few years ago, and honestly, I don't think they'll ever beat that packaging design when it comes to collector's editions. Although that's probably not going to be released until sometime after 9 comes out, maybe before, depending on if Capcom wants to wait to do DLC with the potential gold edition. I do hope that Capcom also considers doing some ports and remasters of some of the spin-off titles in the franchise that haven't gotten that treatment so far. Certain games like Resident Evil Survivor or Dead Aim, for example, could get added onto the PlayStation Classics catalog, assuming Capcom doesn't intend on doing remasters or multi-platform ports for those games. Plus, there's no restrictions for which games get added onto the PlayStation Store, so this means that even games that never had digital ports on Sony's platform are eligible. Although I think what fans would really love to see is an official HD collection of the Outbreak games with a modern invite and lobby system on top of any potential quality of life features, something that wouldn't be possible if the games were added onto the PlayStation Classics catalog. And that's all there really is to talk about, so with that all in mind, I wanted to give you all a quick reminder that in a few days I'll be going to Gamescom to play both Resident Evil and Onimusha at the event. I likely won't be able to record any of the footage of the demos for each of these respective games, but I do intend on talking about both of them as soon as I get back from my trip. That said, I'm really excited for this game and the upcoming re-releases of Resident Evils 2 and 3, but in the meantime, I'd like to know what you all think down in the comment section below on everything that I've talked about for today. Also, if you liked today's video, feel free to give it a like, share it, and maybe even consider subscribing if you haven't already. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one. Mata ne!